I never expected to be standing in my grandmother's attic, covered in dust and cobwebs, staring at an old wooden box with a lock that seemed untouched for decades. But there I was, the dull golden key in my trembling hand, my heart pounding like a drum. It started with her funeral. Grandma Rose had passed away quietly in her sleep at 86, leaving behind a lifetime of secrets. She had always been the backbone of our family, the one who knew how to smooth over conflicts, the keeper of traditions, the silent guardian of things unspoken. But her death peeled back the illusion that we were ever truly close-knit. My mother, aunt, and uncle were already fighting over the will before we even left the church. I took care of her the most. My Aunt Linda had snapped, jabbing a finger in my mother's face. I was the one visiting every week while you were off in another state. Oh, don't start, Linda. You think I didn't call? You think I didn't send money? My mother, always the composed one, had barely concealed her irritation. Besides, Grandma had a lawyer for a reason. If she wanted you to get more, she would have said so. Uncle Richard, the youngest of the siblings, had merely watched, arms crossed, as if deciding which side to take. I wasn't particularly interested in the inheritance squabble. Grandma had left me nothing in her official will, and that was fine. I wasn't expecting anything. But after the funeral, when we gathered at her house to sort through her belongings, I found a note tucked inside a cookbook she used to read to me from as a child. For Emily. There are things that should have never been forgotten, but must now come to light. Find the key. Find the truth. The words sent a shiver down my spine. That's how I ended up in the attic, sifting through old trunks, until I found it, a tiny golden key hidden in a tin of sewing needles. It was light but cold in my palm, its edges smooth from years of handling. And then I found the box. It was a small wooden chest, unmarked except for a delicate engraving on the lid, for when the time is right. I hesitated. My breath hitched. The room was silent except for the distant hum of my family arguing downstairs. I had the sudden, overwhelming sense that once I turned the key, there would be no going back. I slid the key into the lock. It clicked softly. Inside, I found letters, dozens of them, all neatly stacked and yellowed with age. My fingers trembled as I lifted the first one. It was addressed to my mother. But the return address made my knees buckle. It wasn't from my grandfather. It was from someone I had never heard of. And the first line of the letter shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. My dearest Rose, I can't believe we're doing this. Hiding our love, hiding our child. But I swear to you, one day the truth will come out. My stomach twisted violently as I flipped through more letters, all signed by the same man, James L. I tried to keep my thoughts logical. Maybe it was just an old flame of Grandma's? Maybe it was nothing. But then I saw the dates. The letters weren't from some distant past before my grandfather. They overlapped with the time she had been married to him. I forced myself to read further, my hands shaking. I know it's killing you to keep this from him. From them. But we made our choice, Rose. I made peace with it, even if it meant never getting to raise our daughter. A child. A child that wasn't my grandfather's. I swallowed, my heart hammering against my ribs. If my math was right, that child was my mother. Oh my God, I whispered. The attic suddenly felt suffocating, the dust and age pressing in on me. My mother, who had spent her whole life upholding the perfect image of our family, of Grandma and Grandpa's unshakable love, wasn't even her father's daughter. I heard footsteps creaking up the attic stairs. Emily? My mother's voice echoed in the still air. What are you doing up here? I shoved the letters back into the box, but I knew it was too late. The truth had already begun unraveling. And I had no idea just how deep the deception ran. I barely had a second to compose myself before my mother reached the attic doorway, her gaze flicking between me and the open box on the floor. Her expression shifted from confusion to something far more cautious, as if she already knew, deep down, what I had just uncovered. I thought about shutting the box, pretending I had found nothing, but the way she looked at me made that impossible. I could feel my heartbeat hammering against my ribs as I picked up the letter again and held it out toward her. What is this? My voice was even, but I could hear the way it wavered at the end, betraying my attempt at calm. Who is James L.? Why are these letters hidden up here? Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to deny it all, brush past it, pretend it was nothing, but the moment stretched between us, thick and suffocating. She took a slow step forward, hesitated, then shook her head. Where did you find that? Her voice was quieter than I expected, barely above a whisper, but not in the way someone would sound when they were surprised. It was the voice of someone who had been waiting for something inevitable. In a locked box. Grandma left me a note to find it. I saw the slight tension in her jaw as I said it, the way her fingers twitched at her sides. You know, don't you? Emily, put it down. She reached out as if she would snatch it from my hands, but I stepped back before she could. The movement was instinctive, my grip tightening around the paper as my pulse pounded in my ears. No, I said, louder this time. I want to know what this means. Grandma had an affair, didn't she? And she had a child with this man, James. And if I'm reading this right, that child was you. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, there was something else there, fatigue, resignation, maybe even regret. Yes, she said, and the weight of that single word nearly knocked the breath out of me. I felt like the attic floor had tilted beneath me, my mind struggling to catch up. I had suspected it, of course, but to hear her confirm it so plainly made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. I swallowed hard, searching for the right thing to say, something that would make sense of all of this, but my thoughts were a tangled mess. You knew, I said finally. You knew all along. She exhaled slowly, stepping past me to the old wooden chair in the corner of the attic and sinking into it. I found out when I was 24, she admitted. Grandma told me herself. I had no idea before that. I grew up believing my father was, she paused, as if even now she couldn't bring herself to say it. I grew up believing the same thing you did. I wanted to believe her, but there was a bitterness in my throat that I couldn't swallow down. And you never told anyone? She shook her head, her gaze dropping to the floor. I wanted to, but by the time I knew the truth, my father, the man who raised me, was already gone. Telling the family would have only caused more pain. And Grandma begged me to keep it a secret. She said she had already spent her whole life living with that burden and that there was no point in dragging it all up after so many years. I felt like my skin was too tight, like I needed to move, to do something, anything to make this all feel less suffocating. So, what? I asked, my voice sharp. You just pretended it never happened? That this whole thing never existed? She looked up at me then, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother as something other than the composed, pragmatic woman I had always known. There was a quiet kind of sadness in her expression, something fragile that I had never seen before. What else was I supposed to do? She asked. Tear the family apart? Tell my siblings that the man they worshipped wasn't even my father? Tell my mother's secret to everyone just to, what? Make myself feel better? It wouldn't have changed anything. It wouldn't have brought him back. I wanted to argue, to tell her that the truth mattered, that it should have mattered, but before I could say anything, there was a loud crash from downstairs. Both of us froze. The voices that had been murmuring below had escalated into something much more volatile. My mother stood abruptly, her shoulders tensing. What the hell is going on down there? I didn't answer. I was already moving, shoving the letters back into the box before tucking it under my arm and following her down the narrow attic steps. The moment we reached the main floor, the tension in the air hit me like a solid force. My Aunt Linda and Uncle Richard were standing in the middle of the living room, their faces twisted with anger. My uncle was holding a stack of papers, probably copies of the will, and my aunt was pointing a finger at him, her voice raised. You always do this, Richard, she shouted. You always find some way to take what isn't yours. Richard scoffed, shaking his head. Oh, don't even start. You're just mad that Mom left you less than you thought she would. Maybe she finally got tired of you treating her like your personal retirement fund. My mother stepped forward, her voice firm. What the hell is going on? Linda turned to her, her face flushed with frustration. What's going on is that Richard thinks he can contest the will. He says Mom was coerced into leaving things the way she did, and now he wants to take it to court. Richard shrugged, looking completely unfazed. It's not like Mom was in her right mind toward the end. There's a good chance she was manipulated. I barely heard them, my mind still spinning from the revelation upstairs. I was gripping the wooden box so tightly my fingers ached, but I couldn't loosen my hold. My mother noticed, her gaze flicking down to the box before back up to my face. "Emily, not now," she murmured under her breath, her tone almost pleading. But it was already too late. My aunt's gaze followed my mother's, her brows furrowing as she noticed the way I was holding it. "What's that?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. I felt the weight of all their eyes on me, and in that moment, I had a choice. I could tuck the box behind me, pretend it was nothing, bury this secret the same way my mother had. Or I could do what Grandma Rose had wanted me to do when she left me that note. I looked at my mother one last time. I saw the silent plea in her expression, the quiet desperation for me to let this go. I turned back to my aunt and uncle. "It's the truth," I said, and with a deep breath, I opened the box for everyone to see. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room had gone completely silent, the only sound being the rustling of the aged letters as I lifted the topmost one and placed it on the coffee table in front of me. My mother's face was drained of color, her lips pressed together so tightly they were barely visible. My aunt and uncle stared at the box like it was some kind of dangerous weapon, something capable of blowing everything apart. And maybe it was. Linda was the first to move. She stepped closer, her eyes flicking between me and the box, her voice careful, but edged with something I couldn't quite place. "What is this?" I hesitated, glancing toward my mother, who was now gripping the back of the chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She wasn't going to stop me, but she wasn't going to help me either. I turned back to Linda and took a deep breath. "Grandma had a secret," I said, feeling my own voice shake slightly. "She left these letters in the attic. They were hidden in a locked box. I found them today." I didn't say that my mother had known all along. I wasn't ready to turn the fire directly on her yet. Linda reached forward, picking up the letter on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she scanned the page. I watched her face closely, waiting for her to realize what she was looking at. It only took a few seconds before her expression twisted, her eyes snapping to my mother. "What the hell is this?" My mother exhaled sharply, still refusing to look at her. "It's exactly what it looks like." Linda's eyes darted back down to the letter, her lips moving slightly as she read certain parts over again. Then she threw the paper back onto the table like it had burned her. "This can't be real," she said, but there was something in her voice that made it clear she wasn't just trying to convince us. She was trying to convince herself. "Mom had an affair? She had another kid? And you're telling me our father wasn't even yours?" I expected her to yell, to explode the way she usually did, but there was no anger in her voice, only disbelief. Richard, on the other hand, was completely still, his expression unreadable. He hadn't moved from his spot, his arms still crossed, his eyes fixed on the letters. He was the youngest of the three, always the one to stay out of their fights, but he had never been one to let something like this pass without a response. He finally stepped forward, picking up a different letter from the box, and his voice was low when he spoke. "Did Dad know?" My mother looked up then, finally meeting his gaze, and the way her face softened just slightly told me that she had been dreading that question most of all. "No," she said, and her voice was almost gentle. "He never knew." Richard let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly as he flipped through the letter in his hands, then placed it carefully back in the box, like handling it too roughly might undo something irreversible. He didn't say anything else, just lowered himself onto the couch, rubbing his forehead like this was all just too much to process. Linda, on the other hand, was not going to let this drop so easily. She turned back to my mother, her expression hardening, her voice rising now. "And you've just been sitting on this for how long? Just keeping it to yourself while we lived our whole lives believing something that wasn't even real." My mother inhaled sharply, like she had been struck. "I didn't find out until I was 24, Linda," she said, and there was an edge to her voice now, like she was barely holding herself together. "And by then, what was I supposed to do? Dad was gone. Telling you wouldn't have changed anything." Linda let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking her head. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to decide what the truth is for us. You should have told us. For a second, it looked like my mother was going to argue, but then her shoulders slumped, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet, almost hollow. Maybe I should have. That admission seemed to knock the fight out of Linda, but she still looked furious, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, like she was holding herself together through sheer will. There was another long silence before Richard finally spoke again. His voice was calm, steady, but I could hear the weight behind his words. Do we know who he is? It was the one question I had been waiting for. I took a deep breath, then reached into the box and pulled out one of the envelopes. I turned it over, pointing to the return address written neatly in faded ink. James L., I said. Whoever he was, Grandma was writing to him for years. Linda snatched the letter from my hands, reading the name over and over like it would suddenly make sense if she stared at it long enough. Then, she looked back up at my mother, her expression sharp. And you never tried to find him? My mother shook her head. No, she admitted. I didn't see the point. Richard let out a quiet scoff, running a hand down his face. Jesus Christ. Linda, however, was already moving. She grabbed her phone from the table, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. My mother stiffened. What are you doing? Linda didn't look up. Finding out who the hell this man is. I glanced at my mother, expecting her to protest, but she didn't. She just stared at Linda, something unreadable in her expression. And then, before any of us could say anything else, Linda's face went pale. Oh my God. Richard and I both moved at the same time, leaning over to look at her screen. The web page was open to an old article, dated decades ago. The photo was small, black and white, but clear enough that I could see him. A man, younger than I had imagined, standing in front of a local business, smiling at the camera. Next to him was a woman, and in her arms was a baby. Richard read the article first. His lips moved slightly as he scanned the words, then his whole body stiffened. He had another family, he murmured. I felt my stomach drop. What? Linda looked up at me, and her face was stricken, like she wasn't sure if she should say what she had just read out loud. But she did. He had a wife. And another child. Silence fell over the room again, heavier than before. My mother didn't look surprised. She didn't look anything at all. I stared at the screen, at the photo, at the baby in the woman's arms, and my heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just about Grandma's secret anymore. There was another family out there. And we had no idea if they even knew we existed. No one moved. The article on Linda's phone remained open, the black and white photo staring back at us, frozen in time. A man with an easy smile, a woman holding a baby, a life that had nothing to do with us, and yet, somehow, everything to do with us. My fingers curled into my palms as I processed the weight of what this meant. James L. wasn't just some mysterious figure from my grandmother's past. He had a whole other life, another family, and the reality of it settled heavily in my chest. Linda exhaled sharply, her knuckles white from how tightly she was gripping her phone. This is insane. You mean to tell me that Mom had an affair with a man who already had a wife and kid? That she was fine being what? Some side woman. Her voice was raw, disbelief and anger layered beneath every word. My mother still hadn't said a word, still hadn't reacted in any meaningful way since the discovery of the article. She was just staring, her expression unreadable, but I saw the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers dug into the fabric of her pants. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was eerily calm. She wasn't just his affair. They loved each other. Linda let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Loved each other? Are you serious? He had a wife, a family, and Mom was okay with that. My mother turned toward her, finally meeting her eyes, and the exhaustion in her expression made something tighten in my chest. I don't know what she was okay with, she admitted. I wasn't there. I don't know if she knew about his family when it started or if she found out later. I don't know if he lied to her or if she convinced herself that love was enough to justify what they were doing. But I do know she chose to keep me, to raise me as dads, and she took that secret to her grave. Whether we like it or not, That was her decision. Linda clenched her jaw, shaking her head in frustration, but Richard, who had remained silent for the last several minutes, leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The question now is, does this other family know? Did his wife ever find out about Grandma? He reached for the phone, scrolling down the article, scanning for details. This was published in the 60s. It mentions his business, talks about his community work, but there's nothing about any scandal. No mention of him being unfaithful, no public fallout. If his wife knew, it wasn't something that got out. I swallowed hard, the enormity of this settling over me. Which means there could be people out there, people who are technically family, who have no idea about us. The thought made my stomach churn. Somewhere out there, there was another family, one that had been living their lives completely unaware that another existed in the shadows. And now we were staring at proof that our worlds were never meant to collide. Linda narrowed her eyes at my mother. Did you ever try to find him? No, my mother said without hesitation. Why not? My mother sighed, rubbing her temple as if she was growing tired of repeating herself. Because I didn't see the point, Linda. He wasn't a father to me. I had a father, and I wasn't going to go digging up a past that had already been buried. Linda scoffed, throwing her hands up. Well, congratulations, because now we're all living in the mess you ignored. Richard cut in, his voice firm but steady. All right, enough. We need to figure out what we're doing with this. Are we going to ignore it, or are we going to reach out? He looked around at all of us, waiting for an answer. A heavy silence settled between us, and I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down. Part of me wanted to walk away from it, to pretend we had never found those letters, that the past could stay where it was. But another part of me, the part that had always needed to understand, to know the truth, refused to let this go. I met Richard's gaze and took a steadying breath. We need to know, I said, my voice firm. If they don't know about us, they deserve to. And if they do, then we need to hear it from them. Linda let out a sharp breath, crossing her arms. And what if they don't want to hear from us? What if we just tear open old wounds for no reason? Richard shrugged. Then that's their choice. But at least we'll know we tried. For the first time, my mother looked genuinely uncomfortable. I don't think this is a good idea, she said, her voice quieter now. Digging into this, contacting these people, it's not going to change anything. Grandma's gone. My father, our father, as far as I'm concerned, is gone. Why bring more people into this mess? Because it's the truth, I said simply. And I think it's time we stop running from it. No one spoke after that. My mother looked away, her shoulders tense, and Linda was still glaring, her expression filled with resistance. But Richard nodded slowly, reaching for his laptop. Fine, he said. Let's see if we can find them. For the next 20 minutes, we searched. James Ellis' last known address, any traces of his family, his children. It took longer than expected, but finally Richard found something. A son. His name was David. He was still alive. And he lived 2 towns over. My mother visibly tensed, and Linda let out a quiet curse. But Richard just looked at me. You still want to do this? I nodded. All right, he said. Let's find out if he knows the truth. The name on the screen felt heavier than it should have. David L. A man who had no idea that his entire family history had cracks in it, that a hidden past was sitting in our hands, waiting to be exposed. My mother stood up abruptly, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, shaking her head as if she could will this entire situation away. Linda's grip on her phone had loosened, her expression shifting from outrage to something more uncertain. Richard exhaled, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, waiting for a final decision. But I had already made mine. We need to meet him, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Linda scoffed, rubbing her forehead like she was trying to ward off a headache. And then what? We knock on his door and just, what? Hand him these letters? Tell him, hey, surprise, your dad had a whole secret life, and by the way, you have a half-sister and 2 nieces or nephews, or whatever we are to each other. Do you even hear how insane that sounds? Richard shot her a sharp look, but didn't immediately disagree. My mother, however, was already shaking her head more forcefully now, her voice tight when she spoke. I don't want to meet him. I don't want to hear his side of the story. I don't need anything from him. And neither do any of you. It would have been easier to let her have the last word. To let the secret stay buried, to move on, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But something deep inside me refused to let go. It wasn't just about my mother's past anymore. It was about the truth, about understanding the full picture of where we came from. I'm not doing this for you, I said, looking straight at her. I'm doing this because it matters. It matters to me. For a second, I thought she might fight harder, but something in her seemed to deflate. She sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor, and for the first time since this all started, she looked tired. Fine, she muttered. But don't expect anything from this. Don't expect closure. Some things don't have neat endings. Richard finally typed something, clicking on a profile link. His business is still running. He owns a small shop, antique furniture, of all things. It's about 40 minutes from here. Linda rolled her eyes. Great. At least he's not hard to find. The decision was made. The next morning, Richard and I drove to the address listed online. Linda had refused to come, claiming she had no interest in watching this disaster unfold, and my mother had stayed silent when we left. The car ride was mostly quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. I kept picturing a man opening the door, confused at our arrival, watching as his entire understanding of his father shattered in front of him. The shop was small but well-maintained, the kind of place that had probably been in business for decades, tucked between other stores that had come and gone. Richard parked the car, but neither of us moved right away. Finally, I forced myself to step out, my heart pounding in my chest as we walked to the entrance. The bell above the door chimed as we stepped inside. A man in his 60s looked up from behind the counter, adjusting his reading glasses before offering a polite smile. Good morning. Can I help you? I hadn't prepared for this part. How do you introduce yourself to someone who doesn't know you exist? My throat felt dry, but Richard stepped forward, his voice more confident than I expected. David L.? The man hesitated, glancing between us, his brows furrowing slightly. Yes, and you are? I took a deep breath, gripping the strap of my bag where the letters were tucked inside. This is going to sound strange, but we're here about your father. The change in his expression was immediate. The polite warmth faded, replaced by something guarded, wary. He straightened, his hands resting on the counter, his gaze sharper now. My father's been dead for a long time, he said slowly. Why are you here? I hesitated, then reached into my bag, pulling out the envelope that had his father's name written in my grandmother's handwriting. I set it on the counter carefully, watching his face as his eyes flicked down to it. He had another family, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My grandmother. And my mother. For a second, he didn't move. Then, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. No, he muttered, like he was dismissing it outright. That's not. He stopped himself, his fingers brushing against the aged paper, his jaw tightening. I would have known. Richard spoke this time, his tone firm but not unkind. We don't know if he ever told anyone. But these letters, he wrote to our grandmother for years. Your father and our grandmother had a child together. Our mother. David stared at the letter, his face unreadable. Then, he reached out slowly, picking it up with careful fingers, flipping it over, scanning the handwriting, the date. For a long moment, he just stood there, the weight of it settling over him. I always thought, he started, but trailed off, swallowing thickly. I always thought something was off about him. There were times he would leave unexpectedly, times my mother would be upset for reasons she wouldn't explain. But I never imagined something like this. I didn't know what to say. He looked up then, and there was something different in his expression. Not anger. Not resentment. Just an exhaustion that mirrored what I had seen in my mother. Does she know? He asked. She's known for years, I admitted. But she never wanted to find you. She never wanted to dig into it. He let out a breath, setting the letter down carefully, his hands resting on the counter like he needed the support. Then, after what felt like forever, he nodded. "I need time," he said simply, "to go through this, to process it." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. "I get it." There was no grand moment of realization, no dramatic confrontation. Just a man learning that his father was not the man he thought he was. A man realizing that his family had never been as whole as he believed. Richard placed a small card on the counter, his number, I assumed. "If you want to talk," he said, "we're here." David didn't say much else. He just nodded again, glancing back down at the letter, his fingers tracing the edges. And as Richard and I walked out of the shop, stepping back into the quiet of the morning, I realized my mother had been right. Some things don't have neat endings. But at least, for the first time, the truth was no longer a secret.